Hi, I'm your host Vasco Duarte. Welcome to the Scrum Master Toolbox podcast, where we share tips and tricks from Scrum Masters around the world. Every day, we bring you inspiring answers to important questions that all Scrum Masters face day after day. Hello everybody, welcome to a very special bonus episode. And for today's episode, we have with us Tom Cagley and Jeremy Willets. Gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having us.
Yes, thank you so much, Vasco.
So Tom, whom I've met many, many years ago, and we've done quite a few episodes together. I should put the link on those to those on the show notes as well. Specializes in enhancing software development team effectiveness through a focus on people, agility, and feedback. And through his consultancy, he offers training, guidance, and coaching for organizational transformation, aiming for higher throughput, value focus, and continuous quality improvement. Jeremy, who is Tom's co-author, and we'll talk about what that book is in a second, is a dedicated coach and technology leader, guiding individuals and organizations from chaos to predictable delivery, which happens to be the subtitle of the book as well. He's an author, speaker, and trainer, and he manages Scrum Masters and Agile coaches in his day job. So today, Tom and Jeremy are here to explore their thinking and ideas around mastering work intake for Agile teams and organizations, a book they've published and is now available in the usual outlets. Look out for the direct links on the show notes. So let's dive straight into the book itself. And I know, because I've written one and it wasn't even as big as yours, that it takes quite a lot of effort to write the book. So there must have been a really burning fire within you guys to be able to go through with that project to completion. So let's start with Tom. What triggered you to write this book? What were the problems you were seeing that you wanted to tackle?
Well, it boils down to one simple observation. And that is, most people who try to transform, and we can pick on that word all we want, try to be agile, don't do it well. They fail. They fail multiple times. I've made a career out of going in and trying to help teams and organizations that have done this multiple times. And it really boils down to, in many cases, they just don't control the flow of work. They say yes to everything. They start everything. They never finish everything or anything even. And that's a factor of work intake. And so as Jeremy and I discuss this, if we really wanted to make an impact on the world, right, we have to talk about something that nobody thinks is sexy, and that's work intake, whether it's at the organization level, portfolio level, or team level. If you don't get that right, there's no Agile for you.
I don't know if it's not sexy, especially for the audience of this podcast who work with work intake all the time, every day, every single day. But Jeremy, how about you? Because you're also the author of the book, right? You both wrote this book together, and I know how hard it is. So what drove you? What motivated you, to go through with this project?
Sure. In a word, Tom. Tom's the one who motivated me. Tom and I had gotten started, like many, during the pandemic, doing some happy hour Friday calls. And Tom had this idea about writing a book on work intake, and he pitched it to me and asked me if I wanted to participate. And I jumped at the chance. It occupied lots of time, that we all had around the world during those days when we couldn't really go outside even. But then after the pandemic had ended, Tom and I developed, I think, a really great rapport. We certainly deepened our own friendship and relationship, and we bonded over this topic. And I think it is a critical topic that doesn't get enough coverage. One of the first things that Tom and I did when we had this idea was to consult Tom Cagley's bookshelf that you can see sitting there behind him. It's not a fake Teams background. It's an actual bookshelf of books. We consulted that bookshelf to look for, whether this topic was covered in other Agile texts we admire. We didn't find much. So that was part of the reason why we thought we needed to put this book out into the world.
So what was, you don't need to say what book it was. Let's not give partial credit to anyone. But what were some of the topics that you found in the Agile literature that got the closest to the work intake topic as you tackle it in your book, Jeremy?
Well, I think we really loved Dan Vacante's book, Actionable Agile. I think that was one we definitely leveraged. I know we leveraged that book for one of our working definitions of flow. So I think if I have to point at one book, it's probably that one. It's definitely one that inspired a lot of our work intake concept.
There was another, and it's actually, I think we even mentioned it in the preface. Jim Benson's Why Limit WIP. And,
yes, right.
and very frankly, both of us, I think both of us have read the book probably nearly at the same time, different places perhaps, but we see this as sort of, even though that's a very thin book, as sort of the next stage in those sorts of ideas. So yeah, Dan Vacante's, book, Actionable Agile Metrics, his other two books, even more recently, all had an influence, but Benson's book, Why Limit WIP, really was probably sort of the idea, the nub of the idea that was sort of caused us to start thinking down this path.
All right, so now we've established a little bit the context of the book. People can already start imagining, especially if they read those books, and the links will be in the show notes as usual, what you're talking about in your own book. But let's get to what I like, which is first, let's define the problem. All right, so I would like to talk about what is the problem as you see it, maybe just a few symptoms. If that's how you prefer, that's fine. And then what is the definition of work intake? Let's start with Jeremy.
Sure. I mean, I'll continue the riff on Jim Benson's book. I think, the subtitle of Why Limit WIP is We Are Drowning in Work. And so at one point, Tom and I were thinking about water metaphors to describe work intake. And I think we even have one in the book that describes how, work getting done is sort of like water. It finds a way to get to places. And I think that's what we've seen in so many cases, whether it's as we work with organizations or teams, work always finds a way to get done, whether it's through the proverbial front door and the official process, or whether it's through a side door, or perhaps an after-work conversation over beers. These things find a way to happen. And so and another real fundamental part of writing this book was some of the decisioning we made around the wording. So for a while, we had titled this book Work Entry, because a lot of what Tom had seen, what I had seen, frankly, was people forced to do work being pushed into a system that was already overloaded, versus this idealized picture of work intake where you have the funnel metaphor and things just fall into the funnel and they magically get prioritized and done. So all of that was part of the journey to us stumbling upon this work intake concept.
So I'll actually come back and suggest that work has a way of getting started. It doesn't always have a way of getting done.
Very, very true.
So I most recently had actually a water in my basement, which in the northern part of the United States is just about the least fun thing in the whole world. I don't know where it came from. It wasn't around my house. It found a way of leaking in. That caused all sorts of work. Everything that was planned for a whole weekend gets shoved aside. We see this over and over and over. Work intake, right? Or work entry, if you want to use a forcible negative word, right? Work entry. If it's coming in, it's the process of how people decide on what to do at any period of time. So it includes not only the backlog, if we are using backlogs, but prioritization, sequencing, which is another code word for deciding what goes first, prioritization, value, and all that stuff. But as technicians, right, we know darn well that some things that are lower value have to go first, because you need a server if you're going to actually implement. It's not the server that has the value, it's the software. So all of those things are part and parcel of work intake. But that whole process, and don't get crazy over the word process, but that whole process is work intake, how you make those decisions.
And I do want to call attention to this idea that you both mentioned, that work always finds a way to come in to get started. And one of the things that I've always, and well, not always, but quite often talk to my teams is that we very often are afraid of stopping some work, but the important work always finds a way to come up in the priority list, right? We can even throw stuff away. It just comes back, right? And
yeah,
one of the things that has always been hard for me to understand is, why are people so afraid of saying no, or at least not right now, if we want to use a little bit more diplomatic statement? How about you guys? What do you find are the reasons for people to just say yes to everything? Jeremy, let's start with you.
I think it's just a very human thing. If somebody comes to you and they present some sort of need, whether it's a business need or some other need, I think the initial human reaction that a lot of people have is just to say yes. And that, we cover this in the book. I think we've coined the term yes-itis, but we cover this in the book as one of the major challenges that teams and organizations face when it comes to work intake. It's this penchant for we as human beings to just say yes to everything, whether it's something that happens through the official channels that Tom spoke about earlier, or unofficial channels. I mean, I'll tell you a quick story. Tom and I used to work at a company together when we first met. We worked at a company that was founded in the 1990s, so not that old. It was still new enough that a lot of the people who founded the company were still employed there. And, behind the official org chart was this map of the actual personal relationships. And I could almost point to specific instances in my career where I saw the official org chart just get set off to the side, and those personal relationships that were forged over years and years and years kick in, and all of a sudden work would get done that wasn't on the official priority list.
Yeah, absolutely. How about you, Tom? Why do we say yes to everything?
Well, I'll give you another example, but I'll go back to cartoons because I'm a big fan of cartoons. I think cartoons could teach us everything about life. Go back to the old Popeye cartoons, and there was a character called Wimpy, and he always was looking for, because he was broke, he was always looking for you to give him a hamburger today, and he'd pay you back tomorrow. I think that's one of, we all want to say yes, right? We want to say yes because that we can say yes, and that makes us feel happy today. That's that hamburger today. And we'll defer the pain, the actual payment for that hamburger until tomorrow. And perhaps by putting it on the backlog, if it were Jeremy having me put stuff on my backlog, maybe he'll forget and I won't actually have to do it. So there are a lot of human psychology things. It also boils down to power. And very frankly, in organizations, at whatever level, whether you're a vice president or a CTO, saying no to somebody above you always feels career limiting. Whether it's a nice no, well, maybe some other time, maybe later, because we all know if we stick something on the backlog, especially if it's 300 or 400 items long, that the answer is, they're just lying to me. They're never going to start this. It's no, why don't they tell me that so that I can fire them?
Absolutely. I see a lot of people will definitely empathize with that statement. Okay, but in all seriousness, of course, saying yes is one of those, saying yes to everything, that is one of those very common mistakes we make in managing work intake. But in the book, you also talk about other problems that relate to that, not just the saying yes. So, Tom, let's start with you. What are some of the most common mistakes that you see when we manage work intake?
Saying yes is one of those. Jumping the queue is the other one, and another one where, and again, we talk about, you actually mentioned it, the important work always seems to find a way of getting done. I'd argue that I'm not sure that we go through the process of determining what's important. And what's important to you and important to me isn't necessarily the same thing. So work jumps the queue without going through any sort of rational prioritization or sequencing. So it starts, right? And stuff gets bumped. And we can say that we're doing 18,000. The idea of multitasking is specious, right? What we do is we fast switch. I think it's Vacante who actually uses the idea, or maybe it's Kirsten, of neglected whip. So we just start things. We start the things that are important, and I'm using air quotes around that, right? It's maybe important because you tell me it is, Vasco, and then something else gets shelved, even if it's just up and down, up and down, up and down kind of shelved. So those are a couple of really common anti-patterns.
Jeremy, your thoughts. What are some of the other anti-patterns you see when managing work intake?
Sure. To continue on what Tom was saying, I really like the goal conflict anti-pattern. I think, incentives vary widely across the enterprises that we work with. So certainly the incentive for perhaps someone in sales and marketing is going to be much different than someone in engineering. They may not always align with customer asks. They may align with, gee, what do I need to do to sell more product to get my bonus this year to take my family to Disney World, versus the actual needs of a customer. So that is one of my favorites. And, we spend a lot of time in the book, and we have some activities in the book that really start to hit at the people who are involved in the work intake process and understanding relationships. Because I mentioned this a second ago, so much of this work intake equation is about the relationships, because process is process, but the relationships that people have across our workplaces are almost this like side operating system for how businesses really run. And so that's fascinating stuff to get into.
I don't know if it is a side operating system or if it is the main
the primary operating system.
Operating system. Yeah, that's what I would care to guess, at least. So taking all of this into account, Jeremy, let's start with you. What are some of the key strategies that you guys talk about, define in the book to get that part of our work better, the managing of the work intake?
Sure. We talk about patterns pretty candidly. We present at least a handful of patterns, particularly team level patterns, which I know your audience is going to care a lot about. The gold standard, frankly, is the Scrum pattern, where we have one person, in this case, the product owner, be, the mouth of the funnel, the person who is the single person who, accepts the requests, understands what the backlog looks like, hopefully has the ability to tell people no, and doesn't just throw everything on the backlog to appease people in the short term and delay the pain, as Tom was talking about earlier. So, it might be a little bit anticlimactic to say, but that's one of the main strategies that we do talk about at the team level. It's like the Scrum Guide has great content in it around this concept. They've defined the product owner role in a way that should hopefully handle work intake challenges with the team. Now, having said that, we all work with people. Tom and I have worked with great product owners before, but they still have this challenge because at the end of the day, we're working with people, and those people are subject to, drive-by requests, one-off phone calls from people to do work. And so it takes certainly discipline from the product owner, but it also takes discipline from the rest of the team. And I think that might be something that gets lost in the equation too. Working in Scrum requires discipline, not just from our named roles like Scrum Master and product owner, but from our development team as well.
How about you, Tom? What's one pattern or strategy that you would like to highlight?
To Jeremy's point, I think you can pass Scrum aside for a second. It takes discipline. I mean, that's number one. Another is the problem of team design. And very frankly, many teams are they're working on features, but at the same time, they're supporting systems that are in real life and running. And so you have they might pull in features that they have to commit to, and somebody is actually planning in terms of a value stream. But at the same time, things are coming up in production. The system is down. We can't run. Those sorts of things. And those are interruptions. So at the same time, they have this constant flow, separating that work such that people can focus and that you can have some sort of Chinese wall, which then requires you to build a really not bulletproof, but a really solid, DevOps kind of framework so that you're always, bringing work back to the central core of your software. It requires that. And that's hard. And most, at least the organizations that I work with, either aren't staffed for that or they don't think that they need to. So they
can you say a little bit more about that, Tom? Like what do you mean by many organizations aren't staffed for that?
Well, I mean, that's if you're going to actually separate true software development and pure product development kinds of work and then support work. If you're going to make those separations, you actually need to have people doing one thing, people doing another. If you don't have enough staff and you continue to have an expectation of saying yes to everything, then that's never going to happen, even if you separate them, because people will help each other out. That's what people do. So it's partially a staffing problem, but that's easy, right? It's easy to say it's a staffing problem. A lot of times it is just flat organizational design and understanding that you have product flow teams and then you have support teams, and those have to be separate and distinct and run a little differently.
And I would even care to add to that when we recognize that difference, we start to understand that software is extremely expensive to operate. And maybe that would lead us to say no to a lot of other features, because the fact of the matter is that if software is successful, it will spend orders of magnitude more money when in support than when in development, right? And that's something that perhaps if we looked at staffing would become more obvious. But another interesting point you discuss in the book is this concept of different types of work. Tom, let's start with you. What do you mean when you talk about these different types of work in the context, of course, of work intake?
Well, again, it gets back to we do. Well, there are different flavors of that. One is that there are different, where some people work on features, some people work on support, tickets, the problem tickets, defects, risks, those sorts of things. Each one of those requires, in many cases, a different approach, a different set of design patterns, a different approach to how one, writes code, those sorts of things. So there's that kind of different forms of work. At the same time, people tend to have specialties. They are not perfectly T-shaped or M-shaped kind of people that they can do everything. So therefore, one has to recognize that there are people who are specialists in terms of security. You can't do a Vulcan mind meld and get it across the system. So all of those make how work enters a team, how work is sequenced and prioritized, difficult. This is not just, hey, let's all get and go down to the bar and grab 3 or 4 pints of beer apiece and make a decision. It's more complicated than that. You need to have rational, transparent conversations such that you accept that, hey, we need to focus on reducing our technical debt so that we can increase our feature flow at some point.
How about you, Jeremy? What would you like to add to this concept of different types of work and how it affects managing work intake?
Sure, I'll continue the skill set thing that Tom mentioned earlier because it's something I've seen throughout my career. It's it really makes you think at the very front before work even comes in. do we have the capability within our team or organization to do this? Tom and I had an experience, like little story that we put in our book about a somewhat fictional story about a company wanting to go to the cloud, right? And so they had this old school sort of front end Windows 3.1 looking client that they wanted to migrate to the cloud. And so, in sort of the semi-fictional story we tell, the CEO gets up as part of like the annual planning event kind of thing and goes, "We're going to the cloud," and everybody claps and applauds. And then as the engineers kind of go off, they start to realize, well, we don't have anybody that can actually do that work. And so, like, all of the vision-y strategy kinds of things that our CEOs want us to do. I mean, AI is probably a fairly big one right now. Do we even have the capability internally to handle any work that comes in around a topic like that? And so it's something that Tom and I have seen throughout our careers, and it's a big part of the work intake equation. Imagine saying yes to a chunk of work that you don't have the ability to actually execute. That's a hard place to be.
Absolutely.
That was scary, and I still remember that semi-fictional scenario. Yeah,
and I think many of us listening have been through that semi-fictional scenario ourselves. It of course it's obvious when you say it, but then we end up making decisions that ignore this very obvious point that the skill sets available will affect what we decide when it comes to work intake. Even what kind of work are we going to accept as part of the implementing a strategy or improving the product performance, whatever that might be. Now, there is another topic you neither of you has mentioned it, and it is one of my favorite topics. I mean, after all, I did write a book about it, which is this contrast between upfront predictive planning versus adaptive, right? Like sense, understand the feedback, adapt, and then react. So this upfront predictive planning also has huge impact on the work intake equation. So let's start with Jeremy. Like, how do you, either in practice or in the book, tackle the fact that many organizations still have this upfront predictive planning approaches to deciding what to do, when to do it, sequencing and prioritization, when in fact, in order for us to effectively manage work intake, we do need to adapt to what is happening at the time in near real time even.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, agility to me means flexibility. So, whether it's some of what you just described there around frequency, prioritization, and sequencing on some frequent level, we need to be able to do that, because if we don't have that, we don't have business agility, that ability to be able to be flexible when necessary. I think that one of the real pivotal parts of the whole work intake equation is how often you're getting feedback on the work you're doing. Set the release thing off to the side, but how often are you getting feedback that the work you're doing is the actual work necessary? Because it's those points, Vasco, that are the points where you need to make that decision to borrow the Eric Ries quote from Lean Startup, like the pivot or persevere decisions are made then. And so, the environment that I work in right now is one where we do build longer term capacity backed plans that go out either 1 or 2 years. And so perhaps that's not the most agile approach, but we have decision points throughout where we make decisions around capacity. We make decisions around which areas to focus on. And so, I'm heartened by that approach. We are not a shop that, puts together a plan and then we carve it in stone and send it to the top of some mountain. And then we all follow that plan for the next few years.
There are a couple of techniques that we directly point out in the book that address this. One is an exercise of attempting or helping people to go through a process of mapping who is involved, from product all the way to team, to understand that web of people such that you can make those decisions in a transparent fashion, so that you can understand what the feedback loop, not just at a team level, looks like. Because very frankly, at a team level, a team is probably not going to make product level decisions. that's going to be product and maybe even higher up, depending on how serious it is within an organization. But if you don't know what those linkages are, it is very difficult to pass that information back up. There are lots of scenarios that we discuss where saying, pushing information up, telling, speaking truth to power, whatever you want to use in terms of your metaphor for that, is difficult. It's difficult just to begin with, because a lot of times it is career limiting, but it's also difficult if you don't know who needs to know. And so building that into your process, understanding your capacity, understanding flow, getting that fast feedback. All of these are components so that if you're saying you're going to put a person on Mars, that you have incremental steps that you actually get that feedback so that you know whether or not you're actually going to get there and whether or not they're going to actually have oxygen and food to breathe and eat when you get there, kind of thing.
All right. So talking about breathing or surviving, of course, there are people listening to us, product owners, Scrum Masters, and Agile coaches. So let's tackle those roles specifically. Let's start with you, Tom. What is the key message you want product owners to take away from the book?
You have to really manage work intake across the entirety of a product. And if that's a team or a team of teams, it isn't just as simple as going to planning or doing your daily replenishment and making those decisions. It has to be a broader approach such that it makes sense and is transparent.
How about you, Jeremy? What's the key message you want product owners to take away from the book?
Product ownership is an active role, as Tom described. You cannot sit on the sidelines and just be a mere backlog jockey. You need to be out front, leading the team, helping the team make decisions, and prioritization is definitely part of the equation. But I also think that sequencing is an often underlooked part that a product owner can play with too. Definitely with the assistance of the team, right? I mean, we're letting the team figure out how to do the work, but I think there's definitely opportunities for product owners to dip their toe in the water a little bit more when it comes to sequencing of work.
And now let's take the other roles, perhaps the most popular roles of those between the audience or among the audience that listens to this podcast, the Scrum Masters and Agile coaches. Jeremy, let's start with you. What's the key message for Scrum Masters and Agile coaches?
The key message for Scrum Masters and coaches is you can't overlook this. I think I'm a longtime Scrum Master and Agile coach, and I think that our profession tends to love to get involved in the execution of work, the planning of work, but this is something that happens so far upstream and has such large impacts across the rest of the stream that you cannot ignore this. Whether it's happening at the portfolio level or even the team level, you cannot ignore this, because if you do, you run the risk of many, many other anti-patterns happening.
How about you, Tom? Message for Scrum Masters and Agile coaches.
Defend your boundaries. Simple, to the point. Understand what's coming in, understand what's going out, and make sure that that you're doing it in a way that it's under control.
So one of the things that I like to do, and this year is kind of the theme of the podcast, is to imagine what the world would look like if people really took this message seriously and really applied these strategies. Let's call it all the way up to 11, like Spinal Tap did. So, Tom, starting with you, how would work look like, and how would our lives look like at work if people took the message of the book seriously and applied the ideas as if they really meant it?
I wouldn't say that everything would be nirvana, because there's a lot else that has to go on, just to take that musical metaphor a little forward. But very frankly, it would be a lot calmer. You would know that you were delivering value, that the things that you're working on were the important things, and it would be at least orderly from that point of view.
How about you, Jeremy?
I also think we would get more things actually done. We talked many times in this time with you, Vasco, about how just getting work started is often rewarded. And I think that if people take the thoughts in this book seriously and do the work to understand how work comes into their systems, the relationships of the people involved, the responsibilities of the people involved, that we would actually get more things done.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're getting close to the end here, gentlemen. But before we do go, the book is Mastering Work Intake, and it's available on the usual outlets. I'll put the link in the show notes for you to find it. But starting with you, Jeremy, where can people find out more about you and the work that you're doing?
People can find me on LinkedIn. They can also go to my website, jeremywillets.com, and figure out what I'm doing there. And
how about you, Tom?
Obviously the same sort of places, LinkedIn, www.tomcagley.com, and spamcast.com.
One of the original podcasts that I started to listen to way back when. I don't even remember when.
It's 18 years old now. It's actually, it's a mature adult in many countries.
Wow. That's of course something to commemorate. Don't forget to go out and drink a glass in the honor of the Spamcast. And if you haven't listened to it, do go back. There's huge amounts of value in that back catalog for sure.
Especially that guy Vasco. He's been on a number of times.
He's been on. I know that too. Jeremy and Tom, thank you very much for your generosity with your time and your knowledge.
My pleasure.
Thank you so much for having us, Vasco.
We really hope you liked our show. And if you did, why not rate this podcast on Stitcher or iTunes? Share this podcast and let other Scrum Masters know about this valuable resource for their work. Remember that sharing is caring.